I recently acquired this Soyo Socket 370 motherboard. I bought this in not working condition, so today we're going to try and repair it to see if we can breathe some new life into it. Let's get started. I got this motherboard in a lot of untested parts, and immediately off the bat I can see some reasons why we shouldn't power it up in its current state. As you can see here, some amateur has had a go at desoldering some capacitors. I suspect this board was used to practice soldering, but thankfully they only seem to have taken away these 3 capacitors as well as this larger one over here. In terms of IDing these capacitors, I simply just looked at the surrounding ones and tried to figure out what ones were the correct size based on the legend on the motherboard. This was a really dodgy way of doing it, but I was desperate, and I figured I had nothing to lose since the board probably didn't work in its current ways. And I didn't want to power up the board in its current state either, since I was afraid I could fry the CPU or something. But I ended up going with these 4 capacitors, which I'm pretty sure were the correct ones, based on other capacitors on the board. Let's just hope. I'm going to go ahead and use my soldering iron to remove the excess solder on the motherboard and solder in the new capacitors. This should do the trick nicely. I'm going to go ahead and use some solder braid here to remove the excess solder and clean up the holes where I'll poke the new capacitors through. They didn't really do a good job at desoldering these old capacitors, but hopefully the board is still in a usable state once I solder the new ones. Desoldering is pretty boring, so I've gone ahead and skipped forward a little bit, to where I'm just cleaning up the holes for one last time. Now that that's done, we can go ahead and insert the new capacitors. When finding replacement capacitors, just remember, you always have to get the UF to match. So in this case, these are 470 UF capacitors, but you can always go up in voltage. So for example, say you have a 16 volt capacitor. You can put a 24 volt one in and it will work the same. This applies to electrolytic capacitors. I'm not sure about other types. Once you've gone ahead and inserted your capacitors, just remember to bend the legs so they stay in place when you're soldering them. And speaking of soldering, let's go ahead and do that now. Alright, so our repair is basically done at this point. We've fixed the motherboard, but before we try it out, I feel like it's a good idea to give it a clean. There's tons of dust on this thing, and that might hinder its ability to work, so let's do that. Anyway, now that that's done, I feel like it's time to go ahead and test it. Let's install some RAM. I'm just using 128 megabytes of PC133. Next up, I'm going to go ahead and install this Pentium III 733 CPU, which I recently acquired and haven't been bothered to test yet. It originally had a ton of bent pins, so I just kind of bent them back. And yeah, so let's test it out. I'm also just going to be using my generic testing cooler here, just to test it out. Anyway, that's enough talking. Let's go ahead and press the power button. And what do you know? It seems to work. I guess I got it right then. Wow. I'm shocked this thing even works. I mean, wow. Anyway, let's go in the BIOS and have a look around. So first of all, we get the Soyo combo features. What could this be? Let's have a look, hey? And upon clicking on it, we can see that it looks like overclocking. Neat. We'll have to try out some overclocking at some point. Not today though, I'll use a different cooler. Anyway, next up we get some standard CMOS features, pretty standard. Some advanced properties, and that looks to be pretty advanced. As well as the integrated peripherals, which this motherboard has a lot of. that was pretty typical for late 90s boards. We also get power management, PNP/PCI configuration, and we get the health status. As you can see here, the voltages are what really matter, because that will tell me whether these capacitors are doing their job or not. And sure enough it is. We're getting all the voltages to match up with the ones on the left, roughly, as it should, and that's perfect. So we've essentially repaired this board back to a fully working state. The next step would be to try it out under a stress test or something to see how it performs, but we won't be doing that today. And there you have it. We've successfully restored this Socket 370 motherboard. You'll definitely be seeing this one in a future video, so stick around for that. This motherboard is specifically a Soyo SY-7VCA. So it's actually a name brand one, which usually means it's pretty reliable, in which case Soyo generally are too. Anyway, that's about it for this video, and I'll see you next time.